I rise to give the budget and reply speech on behalf of the Australian Greens, and I acknowledge firstly that I do so on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, stolen land that was never ceded. Madam Deputy President, don't believe the government's budget spin. This is not a transformative budget. Forget the phony rejection of austerity. Forget the about-face on debt and deficit. Forget the superficial concern with women's economic security, because once you scratch the surface of this budget, you will see that, like the last 7 budgets this government has delivered, it is built on the con that is trickle-down economics. This budget proposes no change to the fundamentals of our economy or to the tax and transfer system. The neoliberal train is rolling ever onward, barrelling through everything in its path, ruining lives, destroying nature and cooking the planet. And up front, in the locomotives, are the LNP, shoveling coal into the firebox to keep the neoliberal train rolling on. Madam Deputy President, this budget was handed down while the planet's climate is breaking down around us, threatening the very existence of life. And while the destruction of ecosystems is already causing a rate of species extinction that is epoch-defining. This budget has been handed down while economic inequality is spiralling out of control. The billionaires are accumulating feudal-era levels of wealth, while real wages are going backwards and millions of Australians are forced to subsist below the poverty line. House prices are spiralling out of control, pricing an entire generation out of the great Australian dream of owning their own home. An entire generation forced to either make a Faustian pact with their bank and live a life of debt, or be at the mercy of their landlord, who can increase their rent or terminate their tenancy on a whim. And more than a century after being given the right to vote, and decades after countless reforms meant to create equal opportunity for women, women are still being disadvantaged. There is an epidemic of family violence, and the toxic attitudes of far too many men towards women are still persistent and pervasive. So what do we get in this budget? What does this budget do to respond to the big social, economic and environmental issues of our time? We get business as usual. Now, sure, some of the rhetoric has shifted, and sure, there are some good things in this budget, as there are in any budget. But underneath it, the same superstructure that created the climate crisis, that is enriching the already super wealthy, that is empowering the big corporations, and that is perpetrating patriarchal attitudes and behaviours remains. In some cases, such as the spending of even more public money to help big corporations make even more profit from burning coal and gas, this budget is quite literally adding more fuel to the fire. But in many cases, it's what's not in this budget that matters, such as all the inequalities and rorts in the tax system that have gone untouched and that will continue to disadvantage young people and women and anyone else who's not in favour with the LNP. The budget provides no solution to the climate crisis, no response to escalating wealth inequality, and no credible plan to increase wages or to lift people out of poverty. Now, true to type, what this budget has done is deliver for the government's mates. This is a budget that should have been and was welcomed by the big corporates and the billionaires. And this government was never going to do anything other than look after the big corporates and the billionaires, because this government exists to serve its political masters and donors. That is exactly what this budget does. That is exactly why the LNP are in this place. That is in their DNA. And nowhere is this government's enslavement to its corporate donors and corporate masters more evident than in its archaic attachment to fossil fuels. Governments and markets around the world are changing tack and decarbonising at a rapid pace. The world is transitioning to a clean energy future as the urgency of the climate crisis becomes impossible to avoid. The US is on board. China is on board. The EU is on board. Left or right, democratic or totalitarian, government-led or market-led, it doesn't matter. The switch is on. The only question left is whether the switch will be fast enough to stop a catastrophic collapse in the ecosystems that sustain life on Earth. But is Australia on board with the switch? No. Is the government on board with the switch? Oh no, it's not. Their determination is not only to resist change, but to actually fight against it. It is as astonishing as it is insane. In this budget, the Morrison government is giving yet another $1 billion in new public subsidies to the oil, gas and coal sectors on top of the over $50 billion in public subsidies that were already headed their way. Their showcase derangement is the so-called gas-led recovery, a shameful exercise in corporate welfare for the rent seekers using yesterday's technology. And it's all about giving public money to LNP donors to build polluting power plants that will push up power bills and will further fuel the climate crisis. Because gas use by Australians, of course, is going down each and every year. And government money for new gas that is contained in this budget is nothing but a white elephant. Australia should be moving to become a world leader in batteries, renewables and green hydrogen. We've got a chance to not only supply the world with clean energy, but with clean resources, steel, aluminium, other metals refined by using our abundant supply of renewable resources. But such is the political industrial nexus between the Liberal Party and the fossil fuel industry. The government is willing to squander that opportunity in its determination to prop up a dying industry. That's why they've served up yet another budget that sells out our children's future for the sake of the big corporates and the super wealthy. Now, speaking of political donations, during the pandemic, when every economic indicator went backwards in this country and when hundreds of thousands of Australians were put out of work, Australia's billionaires increased their wealth by 34%. That is by $90 billion in 1 year, in the middle of a global pandemic, when millions of Australians were unemployed or underemployed. This is nothing short of obscene. And it's an obscenity aided and abetted by this government. It's not a bug, it's a feature of this government's policy settings. 65 of Australia's largest companies were given $1.2 billion in JobKeeper payments, even though they recorded a profit during the pandemic. This included $21 million to Harvey Norman, who paid dividends, which helped Gerry Harvey grow his personal wealth by $600 million last year. It is disgusting. And how has this budget responded to the JobKeeper rort and the obscene accumulation of wealth? Well, I can't say it any better than Gerry Harvey, who said, and I quote from him from yesterday, "They've thrown a heap of money at us," end quote. Well, They sure have thrown a heap of money at Gerry Harvey and Australia's other billionaires. Straight out of Gerry Harvey's mouth, this is a budget for the billionaires. Now, this can't be allowed to go unchecked. The Greens would introduce a billionaires tax, a permanent 6% tax on the net wealth of the richest 200 Australians that would increase revenue by $5 billion every year, money that we could use to fund essential public services in this country and accelerate a transition to renewable energy and reforestation so that we can draw down carbon and reduce our carbon emissions. We'd also introduce a pandemic profiteering levy, a one-off 50% tax on the increase in net wealth of billionaires last year that would raise $29 billion. And the Greens would also require those companies that receive JobKeeper but that remained profitable to pay the JobKeeper payments back. This would return over $1 billion to the public purse that never should have left it in the first place. Absolutely. Together, these measures would help stop the outrageous accumulation of wealth by the super wealthy and go some way towards restoring the notion of a fair go in Australia. The Greens would also introduce a mining super profits tax. Now, not surprisingly, the billionaires who did the best of all during the pandemic are those in the resources sector. Gina Rinehart, Clive Palmer and Twiggy Forrest all more than doubled their wealth during the pandemic. Now, these are the very same people who fought tooth and nail against a mining super profits tax that would have ensured that some of the benefit of the commodity booms that they line their pockets with is returned to the people of Australia. Instead of their booming price just lining the pockets of Gina and Twiggy and Clive, it should enrich the country. But there is no mining super profits tax in this budget. There's no billionaires tax in this budget, and neither is there any walking away from the stage 3 tax cuts that will further turn up the dial on economic inequality. These tax cuts will deliver, the stage 3 tax cuts, a $9,000 per annum tax cut to everyone who earns over $200,000 per annum at the cost, and have a go at this, of $150 billion over the next decade. That is more tax cuts for the billionaires. They've got to be repealed. They were grossly irresponsible at the time that they were introduced, and they are even more grossly irresponsible now. And what's more, the stage 3 tax cuts will immediately neutralise any of the progress that this budget makes towards putting women on a more equal economic footing. The government has clearly, finally and belatedly been chastened by the backlash to its appalling handling of allegations of sexual assault and sexual harassment in Parliament House and its repeated cuts to women's support services in previous budgets. But this so-called women's budget has barely moved the needle on economic security or personal safety for women. And it comes after having cut funding for women's support services for most of the last 7 years. As my colleague, Senator Waters, has said, there's a lot of sizzle, but not much substance. The Women's Budget Statement details $3.4 billion in new spending over the forward estimates, welcomed by the Greens, including $1.9 billion to help support women's economic security. But in the first year of the stage 3 tax cuts, men will receive in their pockets $5.5 billion more than women. They are gendered tax cuts. And what's more, some of the measures in this so-called women's budget are actually likely to decrease economic security for a lot of women. The proposal to provide a government guarantee for single parents to buy a home with a 2% deposit is directly encouraging single parents, many of whom are women, to take on a bigger loan than they would otherwise be able to. It's nothing more than a government-sanctioned debt trap. In the most overpriced housing market in the world, Just how is encouraging people to borrow more money than they can afford and more money than everyone else going to help secure their future? Well, it's not. But that's just how this budget approaches one of the fundamental causes of growing inequality. It continues to avoid the issue that is central to the housing affordability crisis, the homelessness crisis, and the rent stress that many people are experiencing in this country. Australia's real estate is one of the most expensive in the world, and what is the government's solution? Encourage people to take on even more debt, to raid their super so they can spend even more money on housing and push housing prices up to even more ridiculous highs. And who benefits from this? Existing investors, who only pay half the tax they should on the sale of their investment property at a cost of $8.5 billion a year to the budget bottom line. And who else benefits from it? Yes, of course, the banks, who are more than happy to write a loan of any size, regardless of whether people can afford it or not, and whose profits are heading right back up to where they were before the Royal Commission. And they're rubbing their hands together at the thought of responsible lending laws being repealed. This madness has to stop. The Greens would get rid of the rorts in the tax system that has rigged the housing market in favour of investors and done over Australian people who simply want a home. And we would invest massively in social and affordable housing, build 1 million new affordable homes. We could end homelessness and provide people with an alternative to debt enslavement or a life in private rentals. Now, the government's obsession with pumping the housing market ever higher is just one of the ways in which this budget once again does over young people. Having reaped the benefits of cheap housing, free university education, job security and a livable climate, all members of this government can say to young people is F you, we've got ours. It's nothing less than a complete betrayal of an entire generation and of future generations. It will lock in inequality and actively make the climate breakdown quicker. Because people in this parliament, with the possible exception of my colleague Senator Steele-John, won't be the ones who will bear the main brunt of the climate catastrophe. Those in the major parties, of course, as they always do, will get their sinecures, their jobs on the boards of fossil fuel companies and settle down to an extremely well superannuated retirement. And in the meantime, the country and the society that young people will inherit is being run down by the day. And to young people today, I can only and most sincerely apologise on behalf of my generation and those who came immediately before us. Young people, of course, will also bear the brunt of yet another round of cuts to higher education. The devastation caused by the pandemic and the loss of international students of itself is not enough for this government. The budget will reduce funding for universities by 10% and reduce funding for TAFE by 24%. My colleague Senator Faruqi said it well. How can we expect to rebuild when the government is hell-bent on decimating teaching and research? And what's the government doing with the money it's cutting from universities and TAFE? Putting more money into vocational education, most of which, of course, will go into the pockets of the for-profit providers. More cuts to public education, more money for privatisation, more outsourcing, more profits for the big corporates. Now, stoking house prices and making cuts to tertiary education are just some of the ways this budget makes sure nothing is done to address entrenched poverty. This government's favourite way, of course, of entrenching poverty is to punish, threaten, bully and blame people who haven't got a job. And, of course, why can't a lot of people get a job in this country? Because there aren't enough jobs to go round. Now, blaming an individual for the situation they're in is central to the great neoliberal con. It's also the go-to look over there tactic to distract from the fact that the billionaires are making off like bandits. So there again, in this budget, is another $213 million to strengthen mutual obligations. More money spent forcing unemployed people to look for jobs that aren't there while income support payments stay bogged below the poverty line. This is not how things should be in a wealthy country like Australia, because we have a choice. Instead of giving the handouts to the big corporates and the billionaires, the Greens would increase JobSeeker to $80 a day and lift people who haven't got a job out of poverty. And together with investment in public services and public infrastructure, the Greens will provide a national jobs and income guarantee. We can afford to do this. We are a wealthy country. If we weren't continually giving out the handouts to the big polluting corporations, to the already obscenely wealthy, we could achieve that goal. A commitment to real full employment and a universal livable income to help increase wages and boost the economic recovery. It's the right and fair and humane thing to do. To help meet this commitment to full employment, the Greens would establish a $6 billion nature fund. Yes. This colonial state has done a disgraceful job of looking after this beautiful country. Our rivers are drying, our forests are being strip-mined and burned, and thousands of species are facing extinction. Shame. First Nations people are losing totems, and cultural heritage is being wantonly destroyed for profit and for convenience. Shame. But we can turn around and create thousands of jobs in the restoration of nature, in reforestation, in the protection of our lands and our oceans. All it would take is a budget for nature. But that's not this budget. In this budget, nature loses again. Not content with having cut funding for environmental restoration since coming to power, this government has brought down a budget that includes more money to tear up environmental protections and destroy habitats. The government's own review into the EPBC Act found that a continuation of the existing regime would be an acceptance of habitat destruction and species extinction. If you take this budget as a measure of the government's mind, that's quite all right by them. Now, much has been made of how well Australia has responded to the pandemic and how much that has helped economic conditions to recover. But let's remember this. The government outsourced quarantine to the states, they left aged care to rot, and now they've completely stuffed up the vaccine rollout. At every step, this government has hesitated and deflected. Scott Morrison is, in one regard, a lucky Prime Minister. That is, lucky to be the leader of an island nation. Sitting proudly in his office is a ghoulish trophy of a boat that celebrates his cruelty to people who sought asylum in Australia. Perhaps he might now commission a trophy of a plane to celebrate how he's prevented Australian citizens, permanent residents and temporary visa holders from coming home during this pandemic. And his cruelty to refugees, people seeking asylum and migrants, which was his defining trait before becoming Prime Minister, has not stopped. He's stripping back in this budget $671 million from migrants who need social support, an utterly unconscionable thing to do during a global pandemic. But as always, there's plenty of money to lock people up in offshore and onshore immigration detention. They're going to spend nearly $500 million of new money to warehouse yet more human beings indefinitely in immigration detention because the pandemic has resulted in a situation where the government simply can't deport as many migrants as they would like to do. And they're going to spend, and get this figure, $9,300 per person per day on offshore detention. That is nearly $10,000 per person per day on offshore detention to continue to brutalise people who have already suffered so greatly at this government's hands and at the hands of previous governments of both political stripe. It is nothing less than a stain on our national conscience, a foul and bloody chapter in our country's story. This is a budget built on marginalising people, destroying nature, turbocharging climate change and pandering to the billionaires and the big corporations. Just one example of that is its treatment of disabled people. This budget has cut staff to the NDIS while spending $127 million to pay for so-called independent assessments. Now, what that will mean is strangers going into the homes of disabled people, forcing them to perform and prove that they actually have a disability. It is disgraceful and humiliating, and the Greens and Senator Steele-John will fight that all the way. Now, Mr Acting Deputy President, I want to conclude where I began, by acknowledging that we are on First Nations land. This land is stolen land, and what that means is that the wealth that this nation has accumulated and that this budget allocates out is stolen wealth, wealth taken from this stolen land. Australia was founded, colonial Australia was founded on the dispossession of First Nations peoples from their land. And whatever the dollar value of our wealth, we will remain poor as a nation until we are honest about that fact. We need truth-telling about the historical and ongoing injustices faced by First Nations people. Truth-telling about the rapes, the kidnappings, the attempted genocides. We need justice for First Nations people. We need truth, and we need a treaty between the sovereign First Peoples of this lands and the colonising state. And until we have those things, every budget we see in this place will be parcelling out stolen wealth. And in this budget, we get a budget that damages country and further enriches the super wealthy with the profits of this stolen land. Budgets are about choices, and this budget chooses the billionaires over the millions of Australians who are struggling to get by. Well, the government's made its choices in this budget, and the Greens have made our choice. And we choose to take on and stand up to the billionaires. We choose to take on and stand up to the big corporates and their puppets in this place. Their puppets in this place and in this parliament. We have a clear plan that would create a fairer and more equal society, a plan for justice of First Nations people, a plan for a government-led program of action to set us up for the future and address the great challenges of our time, to establish a national jobs and income guarantee, a 700% renewable energy society by exporting clean energy to the world, a plan to build 1 million affordable, accessible and high-quality homes, to revitalise Australia's manufacturing sector, including locally made vaccines, for universal free childcare and for free tertiary education, to care for nature and to restore degraded wild places, a plan for billionaires and the big corporations to pay their fair share of tax so we can afford to deliver the public services and the supports that Australians want and need from their governments. And our commitment to the Australian people is to fight for them every day instead of fighting for the vested interests that hold this country back like the government is doing.